я-то знаю, но все равно, что ваше имя, фамилия и те регалии, которые...
Field.
Можно?
Donald Rayfield, emeritus professor.
Это можно по-русски сказать.
Да, Дональд Рейфилд, заслуженный профессор, профессор эмеритус русского и грузинского Лондонского университета.
Еще раз повторите свое.
Ну, меня можно сказать. Дональд Рейфилд, заслуженный профессор русского и грузинского Лондонского университета.
Хорошо. Начнем, да?
Да, начнем. We begin.
Я по-русски, вы по-английски.
I'll answer in English.
Период 18-21 год, конец 18 года, когда началась уже, вот, Германия уже побеждена, и Грузия попала в оккупационную зону британских войск.
Mm-hmm.
То есть, что для Британии была Грузия? То есть, я так знаю, это была просто территория, которая временно контролировалась Россией. То есть, вы можете вот охарактеризовать, вот, что это за территория была для британской политики, для британских войск?
The problem is that the British didn't agree what Georgia was for them. For some British politicians, Georgia was an ally of the Germans and the Turks and was therefore considered hostile territory. You remember that for over 6 months, Herr von Kressenstein had been the German representative in Tbilisi, and he was received very well by the Georgians. And the Georgians had looked to the Germans to save them both from the Bolsheviks and even from the Turks. So at first, many British officers particularly looked at the Georgians with suspicion. That was one view. The other view, perhaps the majority view, was for the British government that the only important thing in Georgia was the railway line that brought the oil from Baku to Batumi. And that was what they wanted to get hold of and protect. And if it was necessary to be represented in the country and to have influence in the country to do so, that's what they were going to do. But at first there was not much sympathy for the Georgians. Many British politicians felt that either White Russia or Soviet Russia should be the same size as the Tsarist Russia. That they felt that it wasn't practical to expect Georgia or Armenia or Azerbaijan to have a separate existence. There was only a minority of British politicians. There were socialist British politicians who were not in the government. There were a number of people, like Oliver Wardrop in the Foreign Office, who felt that Georgia could be a friendly, independent, democratic state, and who put that forward. But at the beginning of 1919, when the British started taking an active interest, the outlook didn't look very good.
Хорошо. Следующий вопрос. Ну и вот так, как бы это сказать, набыть.
Yeah, step back.
19-й год, это, в принципе, до этого тоже было, но это год, когда были ожесточенные бои на российском гражданском фронте. Там был Врангель, Деникин, до этого еще Колчак. И всю эту кампанию, 90%, финансировали британские власти, помогали амуницией и так далее. То есть, я почему спрашиваю это? Какая роль играла Грузия? Грузия играла какую-то роль в помощи Деникина для англичан. То есть я как знаю они оружие и так далее, и так далее. То есть я хочу, чтобы вы мне рассказали политику Британии, что она поддерживала Деникина в восстановлении единой России, и Грузию в этом смысле они просто рассматривали как объект тыла.
Yes. When the British were supporting the Whites, Denikin and Wrangel, the main object for the British was that these whites should win over the Reds, that they should get to Moscow, that they should get to St. Petersburg. That was the most important thing. Denikin, however, wanted very much to get back the whole of the Caucasus back, and the British felt that was a waste of energy and a waste of time. And that was the reason why the British authorities in the end supported independent Georgia and stopped Denikin from moving south through Abkhazia and going any further, largely because they were more and more disillusioned with the white generals and felt that the only hope of success was if they concentrated on defeating the Reds in Moscow, in central Russia, and not on getting their old empire back. And for that reason, they decided that they would somehow support Georgia. And that led to a decision, a difficult decision for the British. Who could they send to Georgia? The Germans, when they were in Georgia, had a lot of experts. There were a lot of Georgians who spoke German, who had studied in Germany. It was easy for the Germans to establish a mission in Georgia, but there were not many Georgians who spoke English, and there were only one or two Englishmen who spoke Georgian. So they were forced to send Oliver Wardrop as their High Commissioner to Georgia. They didn't want to. You can see from the correspondence that they didn't trust Oliver Wardrop in London for one basic reason. He was too interested in Georgia, he was too fond of Georgians, and a principle of the British Foreign Office has always been that an ambassador must never go native. He must always love London much more than he loves Paris, Washington, let alone Tbilisi or Ulaanbaatar. But in the end, they realized that they had to have someone who knew the country and who was liked. The British were not liked at first when their military came to Georgia, because they were treating the Georgians as enemies at first. Oliver Wardrop treated the Georgians as friends. He was known in the country. His sister, who had died 10 years earlier, was worshipped by Chavchavadze before, was almost one of the first British icons in Georgia. So that was of great importance. And as a result of Oliver Wardrop's mission, Georgia began to be much better represented in London, and the prospects for an independent, democratic, viable state looked a little better. Wardrop always insisted that not only Georgia, but Azerbaijan and Armenia could evolve into democratic republics, and his main aim was to see if he could get them to agree their boundaries and to agree peace treaties between each other. That, of course, as we know today, is still impossible. But it was his dream. He wrote a lot of letters which are now coming to light and being published back to London and to his wife too, in which he expressed that dream. But he alarmed the British a little because he saw the struggle between the Bolsheviks and the Caucasus as a struggle between forces of evil and forces of good, and he would quote the Bible. He felt that the Bolsheviks were a Jewish conspiracy against Christianity, and that Georgia was one of the bulwarks, the defending points of Christianity. And that was an attitude in London that was not received very well. So although it was appreciated how well he got on with the Georgians, they allowed the British to operate the railway and they protected the country from the Turks, it was still, he still wanted to go much further than the British did. Lloyd George didn't see any sense. Churchill didn't see any sense in an independent Georgia. This is the tragedy of Oliver Wardrop, that what he fought for, his government was not going to support.
Хорошо, вот вы сейчас затронули тему, которую я хочу немножко, чтобы расширить это все рассказать. Вот, в британской политике в отношении Грузии были как-то разные мнения, разные факции были, разные стороны там были. То есть вот была сторона вот Черчилля, была Чемберлина, которые не сходились. Кирзон вообще. Вот можно ли вы вот это охарактеризовать, как вот в английской политике по отношению к Грузии, какие течения были и
The British had several aims, apart from the defeat of the Reds in Moscow. One aim was to make sure that their road to India was open. And that was the reason why the British took such an interest in Iran. And they understood, at least Curzon understood, that one of the important aspects of Georgia was that it offered access to the Caspian Sea and from there to Iran, and therefore it would be of interest to support Georgia and Azerbaijan in order to get an open road, the old Silk Road, open to Iran and then on to India. But there was another factor, and that really comes from the point when Denikin failed to get nearer to Moscow than Oryol. Really, from mid-1919, the British began to realize that the Reds were probably not going to be defeated. And in 1920, when the Poles invaded Kiev, but then finally made a peace treaty, most British politicians realized that the Reds were now going to stay, and then of course Wrangel and the Russian White Army evacuated from the Crimea, and there was no hope really of fighting the Reds anymore. And the British, being a nation of shopkeepers, decided, well, we will one day be trading with Russia, and it will be better to have a Russia that is big and strong and capable of trading, and it was in British interests for the Soviet Union, whatever shape it would take, to be the same size, or much the same size, as the old Tsarist regime. So there was that view, and that 1921, that was already being established, that eventually we will recognize the Soviet Union and we will start to trade with it. In America, you notice that in fact they refused to even recognize the independence of Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia on the grounds that Russia should be the same size as it was before. So there was an economic calculation that in fact if they were going to get oil from Baku, they would probably do it more easily through Soviet Russia than through an independent Georgia. So those were some of the considerations being discussed. Apart from the fact that to help Georgia maintain its independence, a British army would have to be sent there, and the British had had a very bad experience with their intervention in Murmansk and Arkhangelsk and in the Crimea, and they felt that this was not practical. There was no appetite to help Georgia, I'm afraid.
Я сейчас спрошу, если вы знаете, конечно, это не вопрос геополитики и не касается таких больших глобальных вопросов. Знаете вы, как жили англичане в Грузии во время оккупации? То есть что они делали? Как они смотрели на грузин, как смотрели на англичан?
I have read a number of memoirs of the British officers, particularly, who were in Georgia, and their main concern was, first of all, that the Georgians had been so friendly to the Germans, and therefore they couldn't be relied on to stay friendly to the British if they could change sides so easily. And the other point that the British made was they did not trust the army of independent Georgia. Well, as you know, there were two armies. There was a professional army and there was a National Guard, which was much more socialist in orientation. And Colonel Rawlinson, who wrote his memoirs, said that there were some swaggering cavalry officers and the rest of the army was not fit to fight. So they had a very poor view of Georgian military prowess, although they enjoyed themselves. Unfortunately, the British officers who went didn't speak Russian, they didn't speak anything except English. They didn't appreciate the cultural life of Tbilisi then, which was extraordinary, the number of theaters, the opera, which functioned in 1919, 1920. So their views were somewhat sour. On the other hand, one has to say that there is the famous train, when the British left, which had a whole carriage full of Georgian brides. So they must have appreciated Georgian women, because about 40 of them had got engaged to Georgian girls and wanted to take them home. And you probably know the story that in the middle of the night, the carriage with the Georgian brides was detached from the train, and they were not allowed to leave Georgia with the officers, except for one woman, an Amire Gibi, who dressed as a man and had gone with the officers, and she went to Britain with her British officer. So there was some sort of appreciation of the local population by the officers if they could gather a whole carriage full of brides.
Я извиняюсь, я по-английски вот.
Это поезд с невестами.
Да. То есть они вагон отцепили, да?
Отцепили где-нибудь, да, в Самтреде или...
Да. Значит, я правильно понял.
Да, правильно, да. Это позорно. Который офицер дал приказ отцепить вагон, я не знаю.
Ну, это вы сказали.
Да.
И как вы сказали, вот эта история, вот сейчас, что вы рассказали, и в том числе вот про вагон, это воспоминания, да?
Есть, по-моему, до сих пор жива Мзекла Шанидзе, она дочь Ричард Амире Джиби, который был вот сыном от этого брака. Грузинка вернулась. The Georgian bride returned to Georgia with her child Richard. And Richard Amire Gibi had then married.
Можете вот это сказать вот складно?
One Georgian bride managed to go out with a.
Еще раз я мой голос перебил. Прям зеркало и право.
Yes, the one Georgian bride who managed to escape with her British fiancé to Britain married him, and she had a son called Richard, and who was known as Richard Amire Gibi. They returned to Georgia, and as a result, I think Mzekala Shanidze is married was married to the son of this Richard Amire Gibi. As far as I've never seen this in print, but I've been told reliably by people who know them.
Она сейчас жива?
Mzekla Shanidze was alive last year. I think she's still alive.
То есть ей тогда было сколько?
No, Mzekla would be something in her age. Mzekla сейчас 80 лет с чем-то. Но она еще пишет статьи.
Как я понимаю, это была ее мать, да?
Да, это ее мать, да. Нет, мать ее мужа. Ее теща. Да, Амире Джиби.
И муж, значит, был от вот
англичанина и от Амире Джиби.
Да, девочка.
Да, девочка, да.
И еще вот вы в интервью сказали, это не записывали, я просто для себя.
Да.
Вы сказали, что есть воспоминания офицера, да?
Это Роллинсон.
Вы можете его мне дать?
Henry Роллинсон. У меня лично нет. Это библиотека в Кембридже. Да. У меня есть вот библиография вот истории, так что я разыщу координаты.
То есть я что хочу? Если вот я смогу вот достать вот воспоминания этого офицера, наша история будет очень как мне сделать это.
Да.
Мы уезжаем вот буквально то есть не успеем вот там.
Да.
Вы можете нам помочь?
Я постараюсь вот.
Следующий вопрос. Это уже 20-й год. Так?
Да.
20-й год. И я, знаете, что хочу вас спросить. Вот, Англия была это та страна, одна из тех стран, которая заблокировала вход Грузии в Лигу наций.
Да.
То есть почему она так делала? И есть ли параллель вот с сегодняшним днем, когда вот в 2008 в Бухаресте заблокировали МАП и зашла Россия?
К сожалению, есть параллели. Unfortunately, there are parallels between 1920 and today. In 1920, when Georgia applied to join the League of Nations, only one major European power, Italy, voted for it. The British and even the French were against. I suppose the reason is the same reason why nobody in NATO intends to offer Georgia membership, that they did not want to have a country in the League that had conflicts and which might require armed assistance. That was a general principle of the League, and I think it's a general principle of NATO and the EU, that they would be asking for trouble if they invited Georgia in, because they might have then to defend it against its enemies. So it was, I suppose, a fact of Georgian history that goes back to 140 AD, when King Parsman II went to Rome, that the Georgians have always expected Rome, the League of Nations, the EU, the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, to come to their help when asked. And when these people are asked, instead of 20,000 men, they are given 5 or 6 missionaries. And this is still happening today. And I think Georgians must now become more cynical and more disillusioned about their friends.
Еще один вопрос, вот этот вопрос уже насчет торгового отношения, торгового между Россией и Великобританией, которое было подписано 18 марта. Это было уже официальное заявление, но до этого где-то примерно с апреля уже велся переговорный процесс между Россией и Великобританией о торговых отношениях. Да? Красин приезжал
Yes.
в Москве, в Лондоне. То есть, это, я как понимаю, это торговое отношение не было настолько, ну, конечно, было торговое, но там еще был политический момент, геополитическое деление тех сфер влияния между Британией и Россией. То есть Британия требовала, чтобы Россия признала Иран, Палестину, Индию и так далее. А Россия, в свою очередь, требовала признать сферу влияния своей, те территории, которые входили в Российской империи. Так это было. И можно ли так сказать, чтобы вот этот договор решил судьбу Грузии?
That treaty didn't decide. Yes. Okay. Okay. I'll start from the beginning. I would say that when the British left Batumi and the French then came to rescue the Menshevik government and all the treasures of Georgia on the Ernest Renan ship and took it all to Marseille, that was when Western support of Georgia was finished. So that would be March, April 1921. I would say that was the death of independent Georgia. That meant they evacuated the government. They would give the government recognition and status in France, but they would do absolutely nothing to stop the Soviets taking over Georgia and keeping it. When the British signed a trading agreement in London with Krasin later in 1921, I think Georgia's fate was already sealed. This was just the gravestone being put on top of the grave. That what had happened was that the British really recognized that Soviet Russia would renew the same relationship with Britain as Tsarist Russia had. There was an agreement in 1907 that they would share their influence in Iran, in Afghanistan, that Russia would not take an interest in India. So what is the difference? The only thing was a little bit of nervousness about Soviet propaganda in the British working classes. That was the only thing that kept Britain wary. Secondly, there was among the socialists a strong sympathy for Georgia. In 1920, friends of H.G. Wells and Lloyd George had gone to Georgia, and a Frenchwoman, Odette Kuhn, had written a book about Georgia, its wonderful men, its wonderful wine, and so on. And so there was a feeling in the Labour Party that although Georgia was dead, it was a pity, and it was regrettable. But when Labour came to power with Ramsay MacDonald, they had no intention of doing anything to help. In fact, it was the French government that persisted in recognizing the Georgian government until about 1933, until they too found they could have better trading agreements with the Soviet Union if they stopped recognizing the Georgian government as a Georgian government.
Еще один такой вопрос. Быть ничего там.
А быть очень мало, очень мало.
Ну, немножко ведь есть.
Нет, меньше. Немцы лучше описывали. Кресенштейн отлично описывает состояние в Тбилиси, где...
Я вот,
Да, а вот британцы как будто вот жили в вакууме. Ничего не замечали, потому неинтересно.
Но вот этот эпизод у него есть.
Да.
Хорошо.
Да.
Последний вопрос.
Мгм.
21 год,
Мгм.
конец января, 20, ошибаюсь, Высший совет Антанты признал Грузию.
Мгм.
И Британия тоже поздравила Грузию и де-факто, и де-юре признанием страны. То есть Британия поздравляла Грузию, когда она уже знала, что Россия оккупирует Грузию.
Да.
Можете вот это объяснить, или что вы думаете об этом, или вот этот факт, как такой?
When Britain finally and the
Если можно, я извиняюсь, если можно, вот мой вопрос тоже.
Yeah. In January 1921, end of January 1921, Britain and France, the Entente, in fact, finally recognized Georgia not only de facto but de jure. And that may seem extraordinarily cynical because they knew that the Red Army was already there in Armenia about to invade, and that the country they were recognizing was unlikely to exist 3 weeks later, and that they weren't going to do anything to stop it. I suppose one has to look at this cynically, or there may have been a faint hope that as Georgia had just been recognized by Western European powers, the Soviets might hesitate and think of some other solution, perhaps something like what they did later under Stalin, Finlandization, to keep it independent, but what in fact Jordania offered to the Soviets when they invaded, some sort of parallel socialist republic, but would rule itself. So it may be a hope that this would influence the Soviets. After all, the Soviets had recognized Georgia's independence de facto and de jure in 1920, which is much more cynical considering they were already planning to take it over. So I'm afraid this is one of those acts that happen diplomatically which make no sense, no practical sense whatsoever.
И последний вопрос, ваше мнение. Могла ли Грузия, какой процент был, то есть, того, чтобы Грузия бы сохранила свою независимость в 21 году? То есть, был какой-нибудь шанс?
It had a possibility. I think the problem was that the armed forces preferred to fight their own officers than to fight fellow socialists. The problem was with the Georgian army, that the officers were old Tsarist officers, many of whom, like Kvinitadze, spoke Russian rather than Georgian, and the men were Georgians who disliked their Tsarist officers more than they disliked fellow Bolshevik soldiers. I think if the Germans had stayed longer in 1918, they would have formed a better Georgian army because they pointed out the problem. The British all saw the problem but did nothing about it. After all, Kvinitadze in his memoirs says there were only 36,000 Reds and he should have had 150,000 Georgians, but he only had 10,000. And he asked, where are the men? Well, we can tell him where the men were. Some of them had died in the First World War. Some of them were in Austro-Hungarian prison camps. But most of them decided, I am never going to fight in an army ever again. So that was the problem, the spirit of the army. Georgia, as a political entity, was probably quite viable, although it would have problems with Armenia because of the Armenian population in Tbilisi. But it was viable. It merely needed an army to defend it. Finland defended itself. And it is a great pity that somehow Georgia could not organize an army.
То есть, если я правильно понял, в первую очередь за свою свободу должна бороться сама страна, и если она вот в таком состоянии, в котором была, вот, она никак не сможет.
Да, потому что соседи только будут помогать, если это в их интересах, если они поймут, что мы следующие.
Да.
А мы сейчас...
Финляндия сама. Но вот с другой стороны, вот Литва, Латвия, Эстония, все уже.